The first thing Rowan Ashford noticed when he stepped off the elevator on the fourth floor of Maple Crest Memory Care was the quiet. Not the sterile, dead quiet of a hospital at 3 in the morning. Something else. Something almost deliberate, like the building itself had agreed to hold its breath. He hadn't been here in 11 months. He knew that precisely because his assistant Sandra had flagged the gap in his calendar when she was preparing the quarterly donor reports for the Ashford Family Foundation. Last visit to resident Henry Ashford, September 14th. She hadn't said anything. She didn't need to. Rowan stood in the corridor for a moment, jacket still on, briefcase still in his hand, and told himself he was just catching his bearings. The fluorescent lighting was always slightly off in this wing. That was all. He had driven up from Toronto that morning, 2.5 hours on the 400, which had given him plenty of time to rehearse the visit. Check in with the nursing staff. Sit with his father for 30 minutes. Leave a check at the front desk for the garden renovation he'd promised 6 months ago. Get back on the highway before the afternoon traffic built up near Barrie. That was the plan. Clean, manageable. What he had not planned for was the sound coming from room 14. He heard it before he reached the door. Soft, barely there, more breath than melody at first. Then it shaped itself into something he hadn't heard in a very long time. An old tune, something his mother used to hum while she washed the dishes on Sunday mornings, when Rowan was small enough that he still thought Sunday mornings lasted forever. He stopped walking. The door to room 14 was open about 6 inches. Through the gap, he could see his father's bed, Henry, 79 years old, former high school history teacher, now somewhere on the far side of a dementia diagnosis that had been advancing for 3 years. Henry hadn't spoken a full sentence in 8 months. He mostly slept. Sometimes he opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling with an expression Rowan had never been able to read. But there was someone sitting beside him now. A young woman, maybe late 20s. Dark hair pulled back, scrubs the color of sage green. She was leaning slightly forward in the chair, her forearms resting on her knees, and she was singing. Not performing, not even really trying, in the way a person tries when they know they're being heard. She sang the way you'd talk to yourself while making tea. No audience, no self-consciousness. Just the melody, moving through the room like it belonged there. Rowan didn't push the door open. He didn't announce himself. He just stood there in the corridor with his briefcase at his side and listened. The song was Danny Boy. Or rather, it was a version of Danny Boy, slower than he'd ever heard it, with the rhythm bent slightly out of shape like she'd learned it by ear a long time ago, and the original had worn away at the edges. There was a roughness in her lower register that shouldn't have worked and somehow did. His father was awake. Henry's eyes were open, fixed on something near the ceiling, or maybe on nothing, but his breathing had changed. Rowan could see that from the doorway. It was slower, more even, like a man who had found a foothold somewhere and stopped sliding. Rowan stood there for 4 minutes. He counted without meaning to. When the song ended, the young woman sat quietly for a moment. Then she reached out and put her hand over Henry's, just briefly, before she stood and began to check the fluid bag on the IV stand. Rowan stepped back from the door. He walked to the end of the corridor and stood by the window that looked out over the parking lot and the strip of maples along the east fence, their leaves already beginning to turn. September again. Almost exactly a year. He wasn't sure what he was feeling. That was honest. It sat in his chest like something that hadn't decided what shape it wanted to take yet. He'd built the Ashford Foundation from a $500,000 endowment left by his mother into something that moved nearly $40 million a year into healthcare infrastructure across Ontario. He'd sat on the board of 3 hospitals. He'd chaired a national task force on elder care standards. He knew technically, professionally, statistically, everything there was to know about the quality of care in facilities like Maple Crest. He had not in 3 years sat beside his father and held his hand. That thought arrived plainly, without drama, and that was somehow worse. He heard footsteps and turned. The young woman in the sage scrubs was coming out of room 14, chart in hand, and she almost walked past him before she noticed him standing there. She stopped. "Oh, sorry, I didn't see you. A beat. Are you visiting Mr. Ashford?" "I'm his son," Rowan said. Something moved across her face, not surprise exactly. more like a small recalibration. "I'm Lena," she said. "Lena Tremblay. I've been working evenings on this floor for about 8 months now." Rowan. He didn't offer his last name. "What you were doing in there, the singing, do you do that often?" Lena Tremblay looked at him steadily. She had brown eyes and the kind of composure that didn't seem to cost her anything. "When it seems like it might help, yeah." "Has it helped him?" She considered this. "He settles. His stats improve. Heart rate, oxygen levels. The research on music therapy in dementia patients is pretty solid." A slight pause. "But also, honestly, I just think he likes it. He tracks the melody sometimes. His eyes move." Rowan looked back toward the door of room 14. "He was a music teacher before he was a history teacher," he said. He hadn't meant to say that. "For 2 years, right out of university, he played piano." Lena was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know that." Neither did most people. He went in to see his father then, sat in the chair Lena had been sitting in, which was still slightly warm. Henry's eyes were closed now, his breathing slow and regular. Rowan sat with his briefcase on the floor beside him and looked at his father's face, the white stubble, the familiar slope of his forehead, the hands resting on top of the blanket. He stayed for an hour and 40 minutes. He didn't talk much. At some point he put his hand over his father's, the way Lena had done, and Henry's fingers shifted, very slightly, as though acknowledging something. Rowan drove back to Toronto in the dark. He came back the following Thursday. This time he arrived at 4:30 in the afternoon, which he had calculated, though he would not have admitted this to himself at the time, was the beginning of the evening shift. He'd checked the Maple Crest website that morning. Evening shift started at 4. Lena Tremblay was in the corridor outside room 11, going over something with an older nurse named Colette. She noticed him, gave a small nod of recognition, and went back to her conversation. He spent an hour with his father. Henry was agitated that day, not in a distressing way, but restless, his hands moving against the blanket, his lips pressing together as though working on a sentence that wouldn't come. Rowan didn't know what to do with that. He tried talking, about nothing really, the drive up, the weather, a book he'd been reading, and Henry's agitation didn't change. Near the end of the hour, he heard it again, from somewhere down the corridor, barely audible. Lena's voice, in another patient's room, a different song this time. Something he didn't recognize, soft and French-inflected at the edges. Henry's hands went still. Rowan sat for another moment, then stood and walked to the doorway, leaned against the frame. After a while, he went back to the chair. When Lena appeared at the door 20 minutes later to do Henry's evening check, she found Rowan still sitting there. She came in without making a production of it, checked the monitors, adjusted the pillow, wrote something in the chart. "He's calmer," Rowan said. "He has good evenings sometimes." She capped her pen. "Are you staying for dinner?" The question caught him off guard. It was a simple, practical question, nothing behind it, but it landed like something he hadn't considered. Was he staying? He had a 7 o'clock call with a foundation partner in Vancouver. He had reservations at a place on King Street he'd been meaning to cancel for a week. "I hadn't planned to," he said. Lena nodded like that was a perfectly reasonable answer and went back to her chart. He canceled the Vancouver call. He ate in the family lounge down the hall, vending machine coffee and a sandwich he'd bought at a Tim Hortons on the way in, which he consumed at the small table by the window while the sun went down over the maples. He could hear the evening sounds of the floor around him, carts moving, soft voices, the distant measured rhythm of the place doing what it did, night after night. Lena passed the lounge doorway twice. The second time she glanced in and saw him still sitting there, and her expression was unreadable. Not unkind, just thoughtful. He drove home at 9. He arrived at 11. He sat in his car in the parking garage for a few minutes before going upstairs, and he thought about his father's hands going still when the music came down the hall. The third visit, he brought Henry's old Theatre Passe Muraille program from 1987. He'd found it in a box in his storage unit, from the period when Henry was briefly involved in community theater between teaching jobs, the period Rowan had been too young to remember and had only ever known as a faint piece of family mythology. He wasn't sure why he brought it. He spread it on the blanket in front of his father, and Henry looked at it for a long time. Then, very quietly, Henry said, "We did long day's journey the next spring." Rowan went completely still. It was the clearest sentence his father had spoken in nearly a year. 4 words, 5, counting the contraction, and then Henry went quiet again, his gaze drifting back toward the ceiling. But it had been there, real and specific, and his. Lena appeared in the doorway during rounds about 20 minutes later and found Rowan sitting forward with both elbows on his knees, eyes red. She didn't say anything. She came in quietly, checked what needed checking, and on her way out she paused at the door. "Good day?" she asked. Rowan looked at her. He spoke. Her face changed, a real smile, not a professional one. "I know, Colette heard it in the hall." She hesitated. That happens sometimes, with the right prompt. "You don't find that, I don't know, strange, sad?" Lena thought about it seriously. She did that, he'd noticed. She took questions seriously, even the ones that didn't have clean answers. "I think it's just how memory works," she said. "It doesn't disappear. It just needs something to pull it back up." He asked her about the singing, formally on his 5th visit. They were in the corridor. It was a Thursday again. He'd made Thursdays a standing appointment in his calendar now, flagged in blue, and he'd caught her just before she went to break. He'd prepared what he wanted to say, more or less. He'd been thinking about it for 2 weeks. "I'd like to fund something," he said. "A proper music therapy program, not just for this floor, for the whole facility. Certified therapist, structured sessions, the research component. I've looked at the models in Vancouver and in Montreal. There are 2 good templates." Lena looked at him for a moment. "I'm not trying to formalize what you do," he added. "That's not what this is. What you do is." He stopped. "It's different. What I'm talking about is something structural, something that stays when staff changes. But you'd need to be involved. You know this floor. You know these patients." "I'm an RN," she said, "not a music therapist." "I know. You'd work alongside the therapist, help design the intake process, make it actually match the patients here instead of being something generic that gets implemented badly." She crossed her arms, not defensively, more like she was holding the idea. "Why are you doing this?" He answered honestly, which surprised him a little. "Because I've been giving money to health care for 15 years, and I didn't know my father liked music until I stood in a hallway and heard a stranger singing to him." Lena uncrossed her arms. "I'll think about it," she said. She came back to him 2 days later. She left a message with Sandra, which he found oddly formal and also somehow endearing, and said she had 3 conditions. First, the program had to be designed in consultation with the patients and families, not handed down from a board. Second, the staff, including PSWs and RNs, had to be trained as partners in the program, not just observers. Third, Lena herself wanted to take a music therapy certification course, and she wanted that funded separately, not folded into the program budget. He agreed to all 3 without consulting anyone. Sandra raised an eyebrow when she saw the paperwork. Rowan did not explain. The program took 8 months to build. Lena started her certification course in January online through Wilfrid Laurier, Tuesday and Thursday evenings. She was still working full-time at Maplecrest. On the Thursdays when Rowan visited, he sometimes passed the family lounge and saw her laptop open, notes spread across the table, a cold coffee forgotten at her elbow. He started leaving her decent coffee from the place down the road on those evenings. He didn't announce this. He just left it on the table. She never mentioned it directly, but one Thursday in February she left him a sticky note on the empty cup. "You could just ask if I want one." Under it a smiley face, unambiguously. His father had 3 more moments like the long day's journey moment over those 8 months. None as clear, but each one real. A name surfacing, a piece of a song hummed back, a look of recognition when Rowan played a Glenn Gould recording on his phone and held it close to his father's ear. Henry died on a Wednesday morning in late April, quietly with Colette and a night shift nurse whose name was Darren in the room. Rowan was on a flight from Ottawa when Sandra called. He landed at Pearson and sat in the terminal for a while before he called a car. He did not cry on the flight. He cried in the terminal, sitting in a plastic chair near the Air Canada lounge with his briefcase between his feet and his phone against his forehead. The music therapy program launched in May, 3 weeks after Henry's funeral. There was no ceremony that had been Lena's preference, which Rowan had respected. It just began. A certified therapist named Sylvie Roy, who'd worked previously at a facility in Quebec City, sessions 3 times a week, a small dedicated room with decent acoustics and second-hand instruments that Sylvie had sourced herself. Rowan came on the launch day. He stood in the corridor outside the therapy room and listened to Sylvie work with a group of 6 residents, and he thought about standing in the same building, in a different corridor outside a door that was open 6 inches. Lena found him there. "You're hovering," she said. "I'm observing." Same thing, in a hallway. He turned. She was in her scrubs, post-shift, her certification program badge now clipped to her lanyard alongside her Maple Crest ID. She'd passed her first practicum in March. He knew because Sandra had gotten a thank you card from the Wilfrid Laurier program coordinator that he'd put on his desk. "It's good," Rowan said. He meant the program. He also meant something larger than the program, which he suspected she understood. "It's a start," Lena said. "Sylvie wants to add a family component. Evening sessions where family members can sit in, learn a few techniques to use on their own." "Good." She also thinks we should document outcomes properly and publish. There's a gap in Canadian literature on residential music therapy for mixed dementia presentations. I'll fund the research component. Lena looked at him. "You're going to say yes to everything I suggest, aren't you?" He considered this. "Probably not everything. Name one thing you'd say no to." He thought about it genuinely. "If you suggested we stop." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the therapy room, Sylvie's voice was guiding someone through a chord progression on a small keyboard, slow and patient, one note at a time. "I finished the program," Lena said. "Officially, as of last week." "I know. Congratulations." "I'm thinking of applying for the clinical supervisor position when it opens, probably in the fall." "You should." "It would mean leaving the floor." "I know." She turned and looked at him directly, brown eyes, that steady composure that still didn't seem to cost her anything. "Why do I get the feeling you already knew that position was going to open?" Rowan said nothing. "Rowan." "The board approved the restructuring in March," he said. "I may have noted that the new clinical supervisor role would benefit from someone with both floor experience and formal music therapy training." Lena stared at him for a long moment. "That's either very thoughtful," she said, "or very controlling." "Probably both." She shook her head, but she was almost smiling. "You know, most people who donate to a facility don't redesign its staffing structure." "Most people who donate to a facility," Rowan said, "haven't stood in the hallway outside their father's room at 4 in the afternoon and heard someone singing Danny Boy like nobody was listening." The almost smile became a real one. She looked away, back toward the therapy room door. "He knew that song," Rowan said. "From somewhere. He would have known what it was." "Yeah," Lena said softly. "I think he did." They stood together in the corridor for a while, listening to the notes coming through the door. Slow, careful, one at a time, and the building held its breath the way it did, and outside the window the maples were coming into full leaf, green and ordinary and quietly extraordinary. The way things are when you finally start paying attention. I keep thinking about the moment Rowan Ashford stopped walking down that hallway. He didn't stop because something went wrong. He stopped because something was right, quietly, unexpectedly right, and some part of him recognized it before his mind had the words for it. That's how it usually works, I think. The things that change us don't announce themselves. They slip in through a door that's open 6 inches while we're on our way somewhere else entirely. Rowan had spent 15 years doing good work from a distance, real work, meaningful work. $40 million a year moving into healthcare systems, board seats, task forces, policy papers. None of that was nothing. But there's a difference between building something and being present for it, and somewhere along the way, without quite meaning to, he'd mastered the first and forgotten the second. He knew everything about elder care in Ontario except what his own father's hands felt like when you held them. That's not a judgment. That's just what happens when we let our intelligence outpace our attention. We become very good at solving problems we can measure and very slow to notice the ones we can't. Rowan could read a facility's outcome data in 20 minutes. It took him standing in a hallway listening to a nurse sing a song his mother used to hum to understand what the data was actually about. What I find honest about Lena Tremblay is that she wasn't doing anything extraordinary. She was doing her job with her whole self, which is, it turns out, the hardest version of any job. She sang because she thought it might help. She showed up, shift after shift, and she paid attention to people that the world had mostly agreed to stop paying attention to. That takes something. Not talent, exactly. More like a kind of moral endurance. The willingness to keep showing up with care even when nobody's watching, even when the person you're caring for can't thank you, even when the building is quiet and the work feels invisible. And then there's what happened because of it. Not just the program, not just the research, not just Sylvie Roy in the therapy room with the decent acoustics. What happened was Rowan sat beside his father for an hour and 40 minutes. He put his hand over Henry's hand. He was there when Henry said we did long day's journey the next spring. 5 words that came back from somewhere deep and specific and real, pulled up by the right prompt at the right time. That sentence existed because Lena sang, because she was curious enough about her patients to actually know them, and persistent enough to keep trying things even without a clinical mandate to do so. Intelligence and endurance, working together quietly, in a room most people walk past. I think about what Rowan said to her in the corridor that last day. I've been giving money to healthcare for 15 years and I didn't know my father liked music. That's the kind of sentence that takes courage to say out loud. It's easier to stay in the role, the donor, the chair, the foundation president. It's harder to admit that the role had become a way of not being a son. The thing about cause and effect is that it doesn't always run in the direction we expect. Rowan thought he was the one who could change Lena's life. And he did, in real ways. But the more I sit with this story, the more I think she changed his first. And that the program, the research, all of it, was Rowan trying to build something permanent out of a moment he almost walked past. He almost walked past it. That's the part I can't stop thinking about.